Welcome back to Broadcasting Seeds, the podcast where we plant little kernels of curiosity in the fertile soil of your mind. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, here to dive headfirst into the strange, the unexplained, and sometimes the downright chilling. If you're here, you're probably a fellow traveler on this winding road of mysteries, conspiracies, cryptids, and those biblical breadcrumbs scattered through history and beyond. Today's episode is going to transport us into a world where folklore meets Christmas cheer, because nothing says holiday spirit quite like mischievous little beings lurking in the shadows, right? Forget your typical warm and fuzzy Christmas stories. We're peeling back the shiny wrapping paper to reveal something older, darker, and infinitely more fascinating: the elves and fairies of Christmas lore. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, Bennett's just talking about Santa's workshop again, let me assure you, this is no Hallmark special. We're digging into the origins of these magical creatures, tracing their roots back to European mythology, and discovering how they evolved into the festive icons we know today. From the hard-working but temperamental Nisse of Scandinavia to the playful yet sometimes sinister fairies of Celtic lore, these beings are a lot more complex than you've been led to believe. And here's the kicker: they might just hold some truths about how we view the unseen world around us. So, grab your hot cocoa, spike it if you need to, and settle in. Over the next hour, we're going to explore how these mystical beings became entangled with Christmas, what they might mean in a biblical context, and how their stories resonate or warn us in today's world. By the end, you might just start seeing the holiday season in a whole new light. All right, let's not waste any more time. Let's unwrap this mystery one layer at a time. All right, folks, let's start at the very beginning. Elves and fairies have been part of human imagination for so long that they might as well have frequent flyer miles in the annals of folklore. But how exactly did these little guys, who started out as mischievous spirits of nature, find themselves entwined with Christmas, the most celebrated holiday in the Western world? The answer lies in the messy, fascinating blending of ancient pagan traditions and Christianity. Let's take a quick time machine ride back to pre-Christian Europe. Picture it. The winters are brutal, the nights are long, and the only thing keeping people going is a roaring fire and a good story, or maybe the fear of what's lurking just beyond the tree line. Enter the fairies and elves. In those days, they weren't handing out candy canes or working on toy assembly lines. Nope. They were seen as spirits of the land, tied to nature and the cycles of the earth. They were powerful, unpredictable, and definitely not the kind of beings you'd want to cross. Now here's where it gets interesting. As Christianity spread across Europe, the church wasn't keen on completely erasing the old ways. Instead, they did what I'd call a cultural rebranding. Rather than banish the stories of elves and fairies outright, they absorbed them into the new religious framework. Suddenly, these beings went from being nature spirits to something a little more ambiguous, sometimes seen as helpful, other times seen as downright diabolical. Take the elves, for example. In Norse mythology, they were called Alfar, powerful and otherworldly beings tied to the gods. Some lived in light and brought blessings, while others were dark and malevolent. When Christianity entered the picture, these elves got downgraded. The church painted them as closer to demons than deities, but their lore was too deeply ingrained to disappear. Over time, They began to evolve into the benevolent helpers we associate with Santa Claus today. And let's not forget the fairies of Celtic lore. These weren't your fluttery, Disney-fied pixies. Celtic fairies, or AOC, were formidable entities tied to the natural world and the changing seasons. They were said to roam freely during the winter solstice, a time when the veil between worlds was thin. Sound familiar? It's not a far leap from that to the idea of magical beings playing a role in a midwinter celebration like Christmas. So how did these ancient tales merge with the nativity story and the birth of Christ? Well, think of it this way. Early Christians needed to make their new tradition stick. They incorporated familiar elements of winter celebrations like gift-giving, feasting, and storytelling, and tied them to Christian theology. The magical beings of folklore didn't vanish. They just took on new roles. By the time the 19th century rolled around, Victorian writers were romanticizing elves and fairies as whimsical, childlike creatures. Authors like Clement Clarke Moore and Washington Irving cemented their place in Christmas tradition by linking them to Santa Claus. From then on, elves were no longer spirits of the forest, but cheerful toy makers in red and green outfits. Fairies, on the other hand, became more ethereal and decorative. Think of the fairy on top of your Christmas tree. But here's the kicker. Even as these beings were sanitized for modern consumption, traces of their darker, older selves remain. The mischievous streak of Santa's elves, the eerie beauty of Christmas fairies, those are echoes of their pagan roots. And as we'll see in the next segment, not all of that mischief is as harmless as it seems. All right, that's your crash course on how elves and fairies went from ancient spirits to holiday mascots. But don't get too cozy just yet. Next, we're heading to Scandinavia, where a little guy called the Nisse has been causing trouble and spreading cheer for centuries. Trust me, you'll want to hear about this one. Let's leave the broad strokes of folklore behind for a moment and zero in on one specific figure that really encapsulates the blend of mischief and magic in Christmas tradition, the Nisse. If you're not familiar with the name, don't worry. You're about to get a crash course in one of Scandinavia's most iconic and temperamental holiday spirits. The Nisse, also called a tomt, depending on where you're standing in the Nordic countries, is a small, gnome-like creature with a long white beard and a red cap. Picture something like Santa Claus if he were 3 feet tall, permanently grumpy, and had a penchant for practical jokes. Sounds endearing, right? Well, don't let the beard and hat fool you. The Nisse is a little guy you definitely don't want to mess with. In Scandinavian folklore, the Nisse was believed to live on farms, acting as a sort of guardian spirit for the household and its animals. But there was a catch. He only stayed loyal to families who treated him with respect. You see, the Nisse had a temper, and if you failed to meet his standards, say by skipping his nightly bowl of porridge, he wouldn't just leave in a huff. No, he'd unleash a whole catalog of mischief. Animals would fall sick, tools would break, and milk would mysteriously spoil. Basically, you'd wake up to a series of disasters that made it abundantly clear you'd screwed up. But here's the flip side. If you kept the Nisse happy, he was the ultimate ally. Families who left out offerings, especially that all-important porridge, could count on his help. He'd make sure the animals stayed healthy, the crops flourished, and the household ran smoothly. Think of him as an early version of quality assurance, but with a side of supernatural flair. So how does this cranky little spirit tie into Christmas? Well, over time, the Nisse became associated with the midwinter season. Remember, these stories originated in a part of the world where winters are long, dark, and unforgiving. The Nisse's presence during this time was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, kindness and respect mattered. People would leave out extra treats for him during the holiday season, both as a sign of goodwill and as a way to ensure their own survival. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Nisse's image softens. He starts showing up in Christmas cards and decorations, looking less like a menacing farm spirit and more like a cheerful holiday mascot. Today, he's often depicted as a helper to Santa Claus, delivering gifts to children across Scandinavia. But if you dig a little deeper, the old stories still linger. In some rural areas, families still leave out porridge on Christmas Eve just in case the niece is watching. Better safe than sorry, right? Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. The Nisse's dual nature, helpful but vengeful, ties back to a broader theme we see in folklore. The idea that unseen forces deserve respect, whether it's a farm spirit, an elf, or even something more biblical. These stories are less about the creatures themselves and more about the values they represent. Treat others and the world around you with care, and you'll be rewarded. Fail to do so, and well, you might wake up to a barn full of sick cows. So what can we take away from the Nisse's story? For one, it's a reminder that the roots of Christmas traditions are deeper and more complex than we often realize. And second, maybe, just maybe, it's worth leaving out a little porridge this year, just in case. Coming up, we're heading west to the misty lands of the Celtic fairies. These guys make the Nisse look like an amateur when it comes to mystery and mischief. Stay tuned. We've left the frosty farms of Scandinavia and are heading west to the mist-shrouded landscapes of Celtic mythology. If the Nisse brought us a little playful mischief with a side of porridge, the Celtic fairies, or OC as they're called in Irish tradition, are about to turn the dial up to 11. These beings are as enchanting as they are unsettling, and their connection to the winter solstice will leave you rethinking everything you thought you knew about holiday traditions. So let's set the stage. In Celtic folklore, the AOC weren't just tiny fluttery creatures with wings. Nope. These fairies were often depicted as tall, beautiful, and otherworldly. More like beings from a parallel dimension than something out of a children's bedtime story. They were deeply tied to nature and the cycles of the seasons, and their influence was believed to be strongest during the solstices, when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. Now, here's where things get interesting. The winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, wasn't just a marker of the seasons for the Celts. It was a time when the natural and supernatural worlds collided. The IOC were thought to roam freely during this period, visiting households, blessing or cursing those they encountered. If that doesn't sound like the perfect mix of Christmas cheer and cautionary tale, I don't know what does. These fairies were known for their dual nature. They could be incredibly generous, bringing blessings of health and prosperity, but only to those who respected their presence. Disrespect them, and you'd find yourself on the receiving end of some serious bad luck. Sound familiar? Like the Nisse. The AOC operated on a sort of cosmic code of conduct. Kindness and respect were rewarded, while arrogance or neglect could lead to disaster. One of the most fascinating Celtic traditions tied to the AOC during the winter solstice was the lighting of fires and the leaving of offerings. Families would leave food and drink outside their homes as a sign of goodwill. This practice, which might seem superstitious today, was deeply symbolic. It acknowledged the unseen forces of the world and invited their favor during the cold, dark months ahead. Now, Let's connect this to Christmas. When Christianity spread to the Celtic lands, the church, once again, absorbed existing traditions rather than wiping them out. The imagery of the AOC was softened, and their role in the winter solstice celebrations was folded into the idea of Christmas blessings and miracles. Over time, these beings became less associated with the natural world and more with the spiritual, paving the way for their evolution into the whimsical fairies we see in holiday stories today. But even in their modernized form, the echoes of their old selves remain. Think about the Christmas fairy perched atop your tree, or the twinkling lights that remind us of their otherworldly glow. These aren't just decorations, they're remnants of a time when people believed that the fate of their winter survival might rest in the hands of beings they couldn't see but deeply respected. So, what can we learn from the AOC? For one, their stories remind us of the importance of humility and gratitude, values that resonate strongly during the holiday season. And second, they challenge us to look beyond the surface of our traditions. Maybe there's more to those twinkling lights and festive fairies than meets the eye. Coming up next, we're shifting gears to the modern era to explore how elves, yes, Santa's workshop crew, took center stage in Christmas lore. Stick around. You don't want to miss this one. All right, let's jump into one of the biggest Christmas rebrands of all time. How elves went from powerful mythological beings to cheerful toy makers in Santa's workshop. Trust me, folks, this isn't just a story about green tights and pointy hats. There's a lot more history hiding behind those smiling faces. Let's rewind to the early 19th century, a time when Christmas as we know it was still taking shape. Before elves became Santa's helpers, they were far closer to their mythological roots. In Norse and Germanic folklore, elves, or Alfar, were otherworldly beings. They were tied to both light and dark, often capable of bringing blessings or curses. These weren't the kind of creatures you'd imagine assembling toys. They were more like mysterious forces of nature that commanded respect. Now, fast forward to 1823, when a man named Clement Clark Moore wrote a little poem you might have heard of, A Visit from St. Nicholas, or as it's better known, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. This was the first major shift in how elves were perceived. In the poem, Santa is described as a jolly old elf, which, believe it or not, was a revolutionary idea at the time. Suddenly, elves weren't just nature spirits. They were tied directly to Christmas and, more importantly, to Santa Claus himself. But that's not where the transformation ends. Over the next century, writers, artists, and marketers jumped on the idea of Santa's workshop. In the late 1800s, illustrations began to show Santa surrounded by tiny helpers, and by the early 20th century, the image was solidified. Elves became Santa's workforce, cheerfully building toys in a bustling North Pole factory. Let's pause for a second and think about what that shift means. Elves went from being these powerful, somewhat intimidating beings to what? Tiny, cheerful laborers? If you ask me, that's one heck of a PR makeover, and it wasn't random. It reflected the growing commercialization of Christmas. By turning elves into symbols of hard work and productivity, the holiday became less about ancient traditions and more about the joy of gift giving and, let's be honest, selling products. Now here's the twist. Even though modern elves are seen as lighthearted and whimsical, they still carry echoes of their older selves. Think about it. They're hidden, mysterious, and magical, operating in a world just out of sight. They may no longer command respect in the way ancient elves did, but their role as unseen helpers reminds us of the supernatural forces that early Christmas celebrations sought to honor. And let's not forget that elves haven't lost their mischievous streak entirely. Just look at the modern phenomenon of the elf on the shelf. On the surface, it's a cute tradition for kids, but dig a little deeper, and it's clear that the idea of a watchful, slightly meddlesome elf ties back to those old stories of beings who reward the good and punish the naughty. So what's the takeaway here? The evolution of elves reflects the evolution of Christmas itself, from a holiday steeped in mystery and reverence to one that's all about joy, togetherness, and maybe a little consumerism. But no matter how they're depicted, elves remind us that the spirit of Christmas is as much about the unseen as it is about the visible. Coming up next, we're pulling back the curtain on the deeper meanings behind all this mischief and magic. What do these beings really represent, and what lessons do they hold for us today? Stay tuned. We've walked through ancient myths, explored Nordic farms, danced with Celtic fairies, and clocked into Santa's workshop. But now, it's time to dig a little deeper. Let's set aside the Christmas lights and candy canes for a moment and ask, what do all these tales of elves and fairies really mean? Why have they endured for centuries, shifting and evolving with the times? What lessons are hidden behind their playful, sometimes unsettling mischief? First, let's talk about symbolism. Elves and fairies, in their many forms, have always represented the unseen forces of the world, the things we can't explain but feel nonetheless. In their original contexts, they were tied to nature and the cycles of life. They reminded people of the delicate balance between humanity and the environment. Respect the natural order and you'd be rewarded. Disrupt it, and there were consequences. In a modern context, this symbolism still holds up. Think about how Christmas itself is a season of contrasts. Light and dark, abundance and scarcity, joy and sorrow. The stories of these magical beings mirror those contrasts. They're playful but powerful, helpful but vengeful. They remind us that life isn't black and white. It's a dance between extremes. Now, let's take this a step further. From a biblical perspective, the themes tied to these beings align with ideas of stewardship, humility, and accountability. The Nisse's demand for respect echoes the biblical principle of reaping what you sow. The AOC's insistence on offerings and gratitude reflects the idea of giving back to the unseen forces that sustain us. Even the modern elves of Santa's workshop carry a message about diligence, teamwork, and the joy of creating something for others. But there's another layer to this, the idea of the unseen world itself. Christmas, at its core, is a celebration of the miraculous, the birth of Christ, a divine event wrapped in the most humble circumstances. The presence of elves and fairies in Christmas lore serves as a reminder that there's more to life than what we can see or touch. Call it magic, call it faith, call it what you will, but it's the acknowledgement of something greater than ourselves that gives this season its depth. And then there's the mischief. Why is it that these beings are almost always a little tricky? Well, if you ask me, it's because they're here to challenge us. Their mischief isn't random. It's a way of holding up a mirror to our behavior. Are we being kind, generous, humble, or are we taking things and people for granted? The mischief of elves and fairies forces us to slow down and reflect, which, let's face it, is something we all need during the hustle and bustle of the holiday season. So what does all this mean for us today? It means that the traditions we celebrate, no matter how commercialized or modernized they've become, are rooted in something profound. Whether you see elves and fairies as symbols, as stories, or as something more tangible, they remind us to approach the season with a sense of wonder, gratitude, and yes, a little humility. As we celebrate this Christmas, maybe we can take a moment to honor the unseen forces in our lives, whether that's the natural world, the people who work behind the scenes to make our holidays special, or even the mysteries of faith and spirituality. Because if these stories teach us anything, it's that the magic of Christmas isn't just in the gifts or the lights. It's in the connections we make, the respect we show, and the joy we share. All right, that's my take on the hidden meanings behind the mischief. Coming up next week, we're diving into another fascinating topic that's sure to keep you questioning everything you thought you knew. But before we wrap this up, let's head to the outro. And that's a wrap for this episode of Broadcasting Seeds. We've journeyed through the ages, uncovering the mysterious origins of elves and fairies, their connection to Christmas, and the deeper meanings behind their mischief. From ancient farmsteads to Santa's workshop, these magical beings have left their mark on our traditions and remind us to celebrate the unseen wonders of the season. Now, here's where I need your help. If you enjoyed this episode and found it thought-provoking, do me a favor. Like, share, and review the podcast. Seriously, it takes just a minute, but it makes a huge difference. It helps us grow this community of curious minds who are unafraid to question the world around them. Plus, it's the best way to keep the conversation going. And hey, if you're sitting there thinking, I've got my own strange tale to share, don't be shy. Reach out on our website or social media and let me know. You never know. Your story could inspire a future episode. As always, thank you for tuning in and for letting me be a part of your day. Remember, the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the best we can do is plant a seed of curiosity and let it grow. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep questioning. This is Broadcasting Seeds. See you next time.
I got bad thoughts that make my mind scared, hold me hostage and they don't fight fair. Who gon' pray for me and wipe all my tears? Who gon' save me if you not right here? Move this darkness and make my sight clear. Take me your way cause I don't like here. Ghosts of my past, they fill in the night air. Wake me up, I'm trapped in my nightmares. Trapped in my nightmares. Drowning, I'm off the deep end. Apparitions of all my demons. All my thoughts are committing treason. All alone, who gon' hear me screaming? Manifestations of my fears, regrets that stretched out for light years. Can almost touch the light, homie, it's right there. Body free but trapped in my nightmares. Wake me up, don't let me drown. All the lights are fading.